Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. welcomes the Reverend Kristina Lizardy-Hajbi. Kristina is Associate Professor of Leadership and Formation and Faculty Director of the Office of Professional Formation at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. In addition, she co-directs the Doctor of Ministry in Prophetic Leadership at Iliff and coordinates the certificate in Latinx Studies for the Iliff DU Joint PhD in Religion. Her teaching and research interests include organizational leadership, liberative and decolonial approaches to ministry, intersectional pedagogical practices, and applied research methods. Kristina is the author of the book Unraveling Religious Leadership, as well as the reports Latino Congregations Trends from the Faith Communities Today and Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations Studies. She is also the co-editor of Explore, Vocational Discovery in Ministry. She is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. One housekeeping detail before our conversation begins. Please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Your engagement helps to ensure that these important conversations about navigating and resourcing the future of the church continue and reach more people.
Okay, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I'm pleased to be recording in person with Reverend Dr. Kristina Lizardy-Hajbi.
Yes.
At the Iliff School of Theology here in Denver, Colorado. Nice day today, a little overcast. Shouldn't be super hot. Yesterday was kind of a scorcher, and this weekend, another scorcher.
Yes. We get a little bit of a reprieve.
Yeah, we do. Well, thanks so much for the time. Looking forward to having this conversation. Share, if you would, anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you.
I guess other than my professional credentials, I would say a little bit about me personally. I am a third generation Puerto Rican Italian here in the United States. My grandparents were born in Puerto Rico and Italy, respectively. So I'm the second generation to be born in the mainland part of the United States. And contrary to most Italians and Puerto Ricans who grow up on the East Coast or in Florida or anywhere in the Eastern time zone, I grew up in Southern Colorado. So right here in Colorado. And Colorado is not primarily Italian or Puerto Rican. It is primarily Mexican-American or Chicano. And so Southern Colorado specifically is. And so growing up with a variety of cultures and around different cultures than who I am is really part of my own journey, and which is another part of why I'm interested in the intersection of religion and culture, and particularly Latino or Latine religion and congregational life.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing what town, city in Southern Colorado?
I grew up 20 miles northwest of Trinidad, Colorado, which is
right southern.
Right down the I-25 corridor. It's the last city on the way into New Mexico. Yeah. So I grew up really in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. Yeah. Close to the Ludlow Monument. If you ever go down I-25, there's exit 27, which is Ludlow, and Ludlow was a mining town in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and a massacre occurred there, actually, a as part of a strike between
I
the
remember
union
reading
and the
about this.
workers. Yeah, so it was actually a site of one of the early. It helped start the early union movement in the United States. So it was one of the catalysts for that.
Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Share, if you would, about your faith journey, kind of what that's looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Yeah. So typical of most Puerto Ricans and Italians, I was raised, or my parents grew up Catholic, and my parents were raised Catholic. And so I was baptized in the Catholic Church. And as a result, was fully on my way to being a good Catholic person. And when I was a child, my dad attended a Nicky Cruz revival. And Nicky Cruz is a evangelist. He is Puerto Rican. He's still alive. He was a gang member in the Bronx. And so he did these revivals around the country. And my dad went to one. My dad is a Puerto Rican who also grew up in the Bronx. And at that revival, he was converted to evangelical Pentecostal Protestantism. And so I was actually raised as an evangelical Pentecostal Protestant, non-denominational. And so we attended a church growing up. And all the way through college, I claimed that as my own faith, and I participated in a campus ministry and did leadership in an evangelical, non-denominational campus ministry, and really found that faith to be really meaningful for me, especially the personal connection with God and Jesus and the Spirit, and is still a part of my own faith today. However, when I graduated from college, I was a associate pastor at a bilingual mission congregation here in Denver, in one of the highest or lowest income, poorest neighborhoods in Denver, and did that for about a year. And very quickly, I realized that I did not have any training to be a pastor, even though I was a campus minister. And at the time, the pastor of the church was working on his PhD at ILIF and said, "Why don't you try ILIF? I think you need to go to seminary. Why don't you try ILIF?" And so I started as a student at ILIF in 2002, which is over 20 years ago now. And this whole new world opened up to me that I sort of knew I needed, and I was incredibly grateful for. So sort of breaking out of the silo of evangelicalism into this whole new understanding of faith and God and multiplicity, really, of practice and belief. And so that began my journey of ministry in a different way. I found the United Church of Christ, which is my denomination. I'm an ordained minister in the UCC. I've been a member of the UCC for over 2 decades. I've worked at the national setting of the United Church of Christ, did that for years as a director of research. And I think my faith has evolved in many different ways as a result of my attendance at ILIF and my shift to mainline Protestantism, which has its gifts and has its challenges as well. But and so I still maintain the evangelical part of who I am, and the sense of community and relationship, and that I developed, and that developed me as a leader, even in my college days, but bringing with that this notion of multiplicity and how completely religion is shaped by the cultures that we're in as well. So that began my love of sociology of religion and studying trends over time. I'm also married to someone who is not Christian. I'm married to a Muslim. And so that is another part of my journey that sort of transformed who I am and living within these multiplicities of belief and belonging that include Christianity, but are expanded much more beyond that. So I think Christianity in the future, or the Christianity or Christianities of the future, my hope would be that they are more inclusive.
All right, you're answering the end questions already. I appreciate it. Well, thanks for sharing that. Are there any spiritual practices you're willing to share that are meaningful for you you'd like to share?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and it reminded me of a quote by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who's a Black woman Buddhist teacher and practitioner. And she says that all life is practice. And I share that with my students quite often. I oversee contextual education or field education here at ILIF. And I say all of it is practice, not just the internship or the clinical pastoral education that you're doing. It's also how you show up in your classroom. It's also how you show up with your family. All life is practice. And so beyond the individual practices of meditation, for me, being in nature, I grew up in Southern Colorado. It's very much a part of how I connect with God and the holy. I would say living life and being in community is a spiritual practice, and seeing that as an opportunity for engagement with God and the Spirit is part of how I do life. And for me, that includes teaching as a spiritual practice. I just finished a 2-week immersion course to rural parts of Colorado and to suburban parts of Colorado. And for me, that was such a spiritual practice to engage in living with and building community with 10 other people, and really enlivens my faith and feeds and nurtures my own faith.
Yeah. I appreciate that idea of life as a practice, because then it's like, hey, I'm practicing. I'm still trying to get better, right?
Yep. It's never perfected. And I don't appreciate the word failure all the time. Right. And so what I say to students who might have said, I'm failing, I say, well, no, it's just practice. It's all practice. It's not success or failure. I mean, there's different waves of that, but it's
especially in CPE, in clinical pastoral education, which I've done.
Yes.
That idea of failure, that's not an idea you want to have, at least as I learned it.
Right.
This idea that you're learning, you're going to do better the next time. It's a good model for ministry and life.
Yeah.
In general too.
Yes. I say that people should develop practical wisdom.
Yes.
And there is a deepening that one gets as one practices more, and it develops into an embodied kind of wisdom. Doing or performing a funeral for the first time or a wedding for the first time versus doing it for the 500th time after 30 years is quite different. Right. And one has developed a wisdom after doing that for so many years. So that's the distinction I like to make rather than success or failure.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. That's helpful. Well, we're here to talk with Kristina today about a couple different things. Her report that she led, the Latino Congregations Trends from the Faith Communities Today, and exploring the pandemic impact on congregation study. So the fact epic, I guess, is the short way of saying a study. And then we'll also touch on some themes from her book, Unraveling Religious Leadership, which came out in April of this year.
Yep.
2024. So I'll try to make sure we get a link to both of these in the show notes for our listeners. But looking forward to having this conversation. So let's start with the study. Can you kind of just introduce the study, the scope, the scale, the goals, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So the report comes out of the 2 research projects that you mentioned, the Faith Communities Today, or FACT study, and the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations, or the EPIC study. And both research projects are housed through the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. Scott Thumma, who directs that center, that institute, was one of your guests a while ago. And so both of these studies. The first study is the Faith Communities Today study, which has been a survey of congregations across the U.S. since the year 2000. The results for this particular report come from the 2020 survey of congregations, of which there were over 15,000 congregations surveyed. The EPIC study is a more focused study on the impact of COVID on congregations. So not as large scale, although they are doing some large scale surveys, but sort of looking at how church or how congregational life has shifted as a result of COVID. And so combining these two studies, we found that there were a fairly substantive number of Latine or Latino congregations that had participated in this survey, and that was really intentional. I know that they tried to get more representation from non-Eurocentric or European congregations. And so combining these two studies and analyzing the results, we were able to get a small picture of Latine congregational life in the United States. Now, that is about 276 congregations total that have 50% or more of their participants identifying as Latino or Latine. So it does not include all Latinos in congregational life, because we know Latinos are in congregations that aren't totally Latino identified, right? They're in Anglo congregations, they're in African American congregations. And so this is just a snippet of particular congregations that are majority Latino participants.
Yeah, great. So you've been kind of using the word Latino, Latina interchangeably. I understand when I was looking at the study here, there is some discussion about terminology. So can you just share a little bit about the terminology nuance there?
Latinos, we like to call ourselves by many different names, and I don't think there is a consensus on that. So sometimes we'll refer to ourselves as Hispanic. Sometimes it will be Latino or Latinx, which is the more gender inclusive term. Latine or Latine with an E at the end is the newest, more gender inclusive term. And so that is the one that I'm shifting myself to use from Latinx or Latino, although in speaking, I'll just probably use Latino or Latinx, but I do try to use Latine. Of course, there is a broad diversity of people from different countries with different ethnicities and different identifications within that large umbrella of who we identify as Hispanic or Latino people. So you can be Salvadoran, Puerto Rican, Cuban. And then, of course, where I grew up in Southern Colorado, people don't say we crossed the border crossed us. Yeah. And so in that part of the country was already heavily influenced by Spain and colonization and Mexicanos and Chicanos, of course, who have been in this country for generations. So there's lots of different ways that we identify ourselves, and it's a broad umbrella. We're talking about an entire hemisphere of the world of people. And so it's really hard to categorize all of us into one grouping of people, but that's sort of how it's gone in our country as a result of colonization and us becoming part of this quote unquote melting pot, although I don't really think we melt into a single sort of soup of people. And of course, there are recent immigrants to the United States, and there are people who have been here for generations, as I said, even in southern Colorado, northern New Mexico. And we speak many different languages. Some of us speak Spanish, some of us speak English, some of us speak both or a hybrid of both. Some of us speak Portuguese, and there are others of us who speak other languages. If you're Asian and Latino, right? You might speak other languages. And there's also Caribbean languages as well. So,
yeah, awesome. It's kind of funny. I wrote a typo here. Share some of thy key findings. So share some of your, I guess, key findings from the study.
There are a lot of key findings, and I encourage folks who want some of the details to really go to the report itself and read it, because it is really interesting and fascinating. And it is one of the first reports of its kind to look at Latino congregations on this larger scale. And so I encourage folks to do that. But with the congregations in the survey, we found that the majority of Latinos are attending larger congregations. So with 250 or more people. So there's a concentration there. And that is also a concentration that's found across all of congregational life, not just Latino congregations.
That was from the FACT survey, really, right?
Yeah. So there's some similarities there with patterns, and there's also some differences. So Latino congregations, like Latino demographics as a whole in the United States, trend younger. So there are greater percentages of participants in these congregations who are youth, young adults, and folks who are in the early and mid part of their lives. Fewer older adults, and that is different than most congregations.
Especially in our mainline context.
Right, especially in the mainline context. Another interesting finding is that the majority of Latino congregations do not own their own buildings. They rent their buildings, or they meet in a storefront. And that's not, when you're thinking of Catholic congregations, Catholic congregants don't own their buildings. They're owned by the diocese in many ways. And so just looking at the diversity of that is really important. But when you're looking at Latinos as a whole, it is a demographic that does not have as much generational wealth as, say, mainline congregations who have been here for 150 years or more. And so because of the recent wave of immigration, but also just because of systemic inequities and racism as a history of our country, there's not the capital present for Latino congregations to raise their own funds. Another, I would say, competing reason for that is because a significant majority of Latine congregations are evangelical Protestant. Many of them don't belong to a mainline tradition or a Catholic diocese. And so they don't have access to resources that could then also help them purchase property or have a building. So there's some competing factors about why that's the case.
Yeah. Let's dive into some of these key challenges you mentioned. And the one that certainly comes to mind is the building challenge. I mean, I'm thinking about this from my own experience starting in church and how hard it is to not have a building and just the limitations there. Like I've joked with people, like I think in Colorado, like people don't take you seriously as a church until you have a building somewhere to meet. But so you mentioned the renting. What are the limitations, or how have congregations been able to overcome, and what's the kind of makeup, I guess, evangelical versus mainline, which again, in the report, you talk about how many tend to be mainline and how many are evangelical. Like, does one grouping or the other tend to have the leg up on buildings? On buildings.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I have to look at participation trends related to that as well. Mm-hmm. So even though the vast majority of congregations for Latinos are evangelical Protestant, what's interesting about that is they often tend to be smaller congregations.
Okay.
And so even though there are fewer Catholic parishes, they're large in number, very large in number in terms of membership. And so for many of these congregations that are trying to rent a building or purchase a building or purchase space for them to worship in, they're doing it and they're small in number. I mean, of course, there's mega churches, there's larger churches that are doing these kinds of things. And often mega churches have Latino ministries that are significant. And so they have buildings and things like that. But for the majority of these congregations, I would say that there's a smaller membership pool from which to get funds from. And related to this, another interesting finding from the study is that these congregations are more likely, significantly more likely than other congregations to rely on fundraising as a way to gain money. Mm-hmm. That's helpful in some ways because if something is an immediate need, such as a pastor's salary or someone in the congregation needs something, or they want to do some kind of mission or ministry work in the community, they're able to do fundraising really well and really quickly, pull resources together. But for long-term asset development, that's really not a sustainable long-term strategy. But there is something that I think other congregations can learn from the ability of these congregations to gain funding quickly when it is needed. And fundraising is one of those ways. So that is another, I think, interesting, differentiated finding from this study.
Yeah. So we've hinted at this, the denominational or network connections. And off the top of your head, do you remember rough numbers on like the breakup between like evangelical and mainline? And then B, like, are these evangelical groupings, like, are they with like SBC or Act 29 or ARC? Those other connections there?
Yeah. I don't know because that data is hidden from me. So the way the Faith Communities Today survey works is that you can have access to the data, but each denomination and tradition surveys their own groups. Okay. And so they contribute to the big pot, which is the large scale survey. And so I would actually need permission from all of these different denominations in order to figure out the smaller breakdown of that. But I can say, having been a part of the Faith Communities Today group, that includes Southern Baptists, it includes Mormons, it includes all of the mainline traditions, it includes UU congregations, Catholic congregations, and also beyond Christianity, Reform Judaism, Jewish congregations, Muslim communities, Baha'i communities. And so there's a broad diversity when we say congregation, although the vast majority are Christian congregations. Okay.
So, yeah, that's helpful. Because again, this is a Faith Communities Today survey, not just a Christian Communities Today survey. Yeah. That's a helpful reminder. Yeah. You've kind of hinted at, or you've kind of touched on some of the ways these congregations are differ from white congregations, trending younger, not owning a building, the lack of generational wealth, relying on fundraising. Are there any other obvious things that come to mind there?
Yeah, one of the other important pieces is that, I'll say two more important pieces. The first is that Latino faith communities are more actively engaged in activities beyond their congregation.
Is that like community involvement?
Yes. Okay. So ecumenical, interfaith activities or community-based activities than other congregations. So they're doing this at greater rates than other congregations. The other interesting thing that we found with this survey was that these communities rely more heavily than others on informal means of technology-based communication. So social media, texting, apps, rather than more formal means that we might see in a mainline congregation like email, e-newsletters, websites. So the way that these congregations communicate at greater rates is, I think, indicative of sort of some of the underlying differences which have to do with culture. And culture includes different ways of communicating, more familial, more relational ways of being for many Latinos and many Latino congregations. Not to generalize too broadly, but to say there is some difference there in how communication happens and how relationship and relationality happens.
There's a question that comes to mind. You may not be able to answer it because I'm putting you on the spot here, but I'm curious, do you have any insights on like the governance structure, whether formally or informally, of these congregations?
So we did look at leadership structures, right, in the Faith Communities Today survey and the EPIC survey, and they are very similar to other congregations. So there are solo pastorates or solo priests in a congregation. There are some co-pastorates, so the rate of co-pastorship is higher in Latino congregations than in other congregations, which was an interesting finding. But I think because culture is this kind of tricky thing, and many congregations want legitimacy or more standing within the broader community, these are patterned after the way congregations have been led and governed for the last couple of centuries at this point. And I would say the influence of Euro-American dominant culture is certainly a part of that. So I don't know if there are huge differences in the way governance happens, but structurally, but culture is always very nuanced, and there might be, and I suspect there are ways that things get done and things happen that move beyond a structure as well, that might be more relational and more familial. So both things can be happening at the same time.
Let's lean into this, or let me ask this, because I think it leans into your book, Unraveling Religious Leadership. But what comes to mind for me, and I think either this was in Ted Smith's book or my conversation with him, kind of about like the cultural norms of institutionalization. Like, I think he gives the example of like, or at least probably we remember this from like CPE. Mm-hmm. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like Buddhists don't go to like seminary, right? But they have to have some kind of formal training to enter into the CPE model.
That's right.
Which was, correct me if I'm wrong, based on like Christian, right?
Yep. So the CPE model is very Christocentric and Eurocentric, and I think they're making some changes to that and making some adjustments to that in some ways. Mm-hmm. But board certification, to be a board certified chaplain, you need to have a master's education, and the MDiv is still, the Master of Divinity is still the gold standard. So we have Buddhist students, we have students with no tradition, we have students who are Muslim, and there's Muslim chaplaincy programs that are sprouting up around the country. And here at ILIF, we've had a history of having LDS or Mormon students here, because Mormons don't ordain folks either. It's a lay ministry.
True. Right.
And so if someone wants to be a chaplain, you need to go to seminary and be board certified. So we have a lot of Mormon students that have come through here for the express purpose of going into chaplaincy kinds of roles. And so that, I think, in terms of how we credential for leadership, is based on a Christian model. It's based on a Eurocentric model, and what we consider expertise as the standard model. In my book, I talk about expertise and the Eurocentric norms around what we consider expertise, and that the Master of Divinity is still the standard for ordination and certification, regardless of one's tradition. And even as someone who teaches in a theological school, who is very committed to theological education, it's something that I believe in deeply, I also critique it greatly by saying the Eurocentric model of theological education does not prepare one and does not encompass the totality of one's expertise for preparation. Learning Christian history, learning the Bible, learning these kinds of rational or intellectual knowledges can be very helpful in preparing people for ministry, but they're certainly not the totality. The totality happens in practical wisdom, the learned wisdom over time. And I don't necessarily think theological schools do a great job of preparing students for these broader ministry roles. And for Latino congregational leaders, many of them do not have a seminary education. They're going to Bible institutes, or there's no preparation at all. And many of them, our survey found at greater rates than other congregational leaders are having full-time jobs outside of their congregational leadership roles. So they actually are sort of doing this tent making kind of work where it's, where they're having full-time jobs and putting together ministries in as completely different parts of their lives.
Yeah. So definitely some challenges there that, like you say, these, like I thought of the bivocationality, I thought of like the access to generational wealth, the lack of resources can definitely be a hindrance. Like I experienced it myself trying to go to seminary, so I can only imagine for others. I want to keep going on this topic, but for sake of time, I want to ask some kind of future-oriented questions. What are some thoughts you have on how these leaders and congregations might plan for the future?
That's a good question. One of the recommendations or conclusions of the report is particularly for those congregations that are part of denominations or larger traditions like dioceses and the Catholic tradition, to find ways to funnel resources to Latino and other congregations of color or global majority congregations, as I would call them.
So the denomination needs to funnel it down.
I think in some ways, yes. And especially because there are many historically Euro-American congregations that are in decline and that are expected to close over the next several decades. So what is happening with those resources?
Well, especially the buildings, right? Because I think, and this is a question I want to ask. So, because it seems like what happens is a Anglo congregation declines, decides to close, building gets sold, and it kind of just goes to supporting the denominational infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Like, what do you think? Like, I guess you could sell the building and direct those funds. Like, should denominations be more explicit about giving the buildings to non-white congregations? What do you think?
I think this is one of the great theological challenges for denominations today. So how are you going to allocate resources into the future as your population declines? And this mirrors demographic trends. So the decline in white U.S. births mirrors the decline in mainline denominational baptisms.
Yeah.
It mirrors that decline. And so what is the theological imperative? Does a denomination hold on to its wealth as much as it can and continue to claim its own theological legacy into the future with that decline happening? Or does it invest and give to future generations of Christians the resources it needs to thrive in ministry, even if they are theologically not aligned with that particular denomination? And I think that is one of the great challenges, because how deeply and how far do we live into our ecumenicalism? And for many congregations, there are Latinos who are in white congregations. There are, many Latine folks who are in many different kinds of congregations. But for newer immigrant congregations or congregations that do not have that kind of wealth, what are the limits of one's generosity, and what are the limits that are taking place because of one's own theology, and how broad is one willing to go in order to really build relationships and nurture faith for the future? That's,
Ooh.
I think that is,
that's good. That's good.
An important question for denominations.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, like, within my own denomination, I feel like that's a challenge within Disciples of Christ. It's like, as they bring on ethnic congregations, it's like, well, are they disciples enough? I feel like I've heard that question. Want to keep going, but I know we're running out of time.
And just to add to that, there are cultural Eurocentric values that are also embedded in that question. And so I think sussing out, like, what really is our theology, and what are the limits of our ways of being as a denomination of faith, not just religiously, but also culturally, and how are we mixing those two in problematic ways, is also a big question.
Folks need to read the book, right?
Yes.
Unraveling Religious Leadership.
Yes.
Last question here before we take a break. What do you think, this is a question I've asked others before, what do you think predominantly white congregations could learn from these? For sure what comes to mind is, you mentioned fundraising. I think, like, I've heard this before, bivocationality, like the African-American church tradition has been, many of their pastors bivocational for years. Anything else come to mind?
Without essentializing, I will say that Euro-American culture is highly individualistic, right? And that is a product of and we're all implicated in that rampant individualism that I think has increased, particularly in the last several decades in our country. And I believe there's a great deal that we can learn from non-Euro-American congregations and peoples around other ways of being that lean more into community and communalism. And I have to credit my colleague, Dr. Bo-Young Lee here at ILIF, who wrote a book called, I believe, Transforming Faith or Transforming Congregations. And she's a religious educator by training. And she talks about individualism versus collectivism versus communalism. And as a Korean woman, she comes from a communal culture.
Yeah.
And so instead of saying, this is my husband, in the Korean language, it is polite and more correct to say, this is our husband, or this is my spouse, this is our spouse. And there are some challenges to communalism as well, right? That conformity can be very constricting for people. Yeah. But how do we find a balance between this communalism and this individualism that moves beyond this kind of collectivism? And I think churches practice collectivism by and large here in the United States. So we are a group of people that has a Bible study together, and we do this study together. But if it's not serving my needs, I'm out. And that collectivism is very different in non-European congregations, to say, no, we're actually committed to one another as families, as people. If you need something, I'm going to give you something. And there's not often that kind of communal understanding in Eurocentric congregations or Euro-dominant congregations. It is in smaller congregations. So you'll find that in rural settings, right? Because there's a different kind of ethic. And I often say, if congregations would be more like white rural congregations, we might actually get closer to what being a Christian and what faith looks like, and not seeing these sort of larger, more acculturated, more successful by vitality markers, or by consumer capitalistic markers as our success, then I think we'll be closer to what the kingdom of God is intending for us.
Yeah. Well, the book is Unraveling Religious Leadership, and then the Latino Congregations Survey study. We'll make sure to have links to both in the show notes. That's a great example of our husband versus my husband, just as the language.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take a quick break and then run through these closing questions because I know you're short on time. All right, we're back with Reverend Dr. Kristina Lizardy-Hajbi. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate this conversation. Let's take these closing questions. I know you got to run, so answer these how you'd like to. If you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do with that day? What does that look like for you?
I believe that there's not much I could change in a day because I'm not God. I'm just a Pope. But I would probably, because of my own sort of Catholic roots from my parents, I'd probably decree that women be ordained.
Okay.
And that LGBTQ folk be granted the rights and privileges, all rights and privileges of the church, including marriage and ordination.
Great.
Thinking in a Catholic frame.
Yeah. Theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
This was a tough question. I've been thinking a lot about my own teacher here at ILIF, Dr. Vincent Harding, and I have been wondering what he would say about our current situation, nationally, internationally. And so I would really welcome a conversation with him to hear his thoughts on life and the world and our call as Christians moving into the future. And he passed in 2014, but I often think about him and try to model and think to myself, what would he think? But I really want to know what he would say. So that would be the one person.
Yeah, I like that. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
That this was the tipping point when we could have done things differently. And we didn't. My hope is that we will, on a number of fronts, on how we are functioning as Christians, as denominations in this world, on climate change, on global war and violence that is taking place around the world. But I feel like we're at the tipping point right now. And so pessimistically, I don't see a lot of change in any of these ways, but I think my eternal hope, which is your next question, is that we embrace and live into a different understanding and way of being people in this world and relating to one another, and how we treat this world and how we live out faith, whatever that looks like for each one of us.
Great. Well, you've shared some hopes. Anything else you want to say?
I would say also that we live into a deeper understanding of Christianity as multiplicitous, not homogenous, not one thing, this or that, and that our cultures bring those Christianities to life, not inhibit them.
Well, I wish we had more time for the conversation, but I really appreciate your thoughts and perspectives. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I always leave folks with a word of peace, so we get to do it in person. May God's peace be with you.
Thank you, and you as well.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.